There is a particular sound a Spitfire makes when its Merlin engine catches, a low rolling growl that climbs into a snarl, the whole airframe trembling like a hound that has just caught a scent. A pilot who has flown one never forgets it. He feels it in his teeth. He feels it in the small of his back pressed against the thin metal of the seat, and he learns, over hours and months, to read that vibration the way a rider reads the twitch of a horse's ear. The Spitfire answered a man's hands the instant he moved them, a touch on the stick, and the nose slid where the eye was already looking. There was almost nothing between the thought and the machine. Pilots did not describe flying it. They described wearing it. That is why the men standing on the hardstand at Debden Airfield in the raw English spring of 1943 are so quiet. The grass beyond the concrete is still winter brown, laced with frost in the shadows where the pale morning sun has not yet reached. There is the smell of wet stone and aviation fuel, and the particular mildew of England in March, and there is the sound of nothing much at all. A truck idling somewhere near the hangars, the flat clang of a spanner dropped on concrete, gulls arguing over the perimeter track, and there, parked in a neat row where their Spitfires used to sit, are the machines that have come to replace them. The men look at them the way you might look at a bad piece of news you've been dreading for weeks, and now find sitting in your kitchen. The aircraft is enormous. That is the first thing, the only thing for a long moment, the sheer absurd bulk of it. Where the Spitfire was slender and tapered, all elegant compound curves, this thing is barrel-chested, deep-bellied, riding high on a long-legged undercarriage as though it has been inflated. The fuselage is nearly 4 times the internal volume of the Spitfire it displaces, and the nose is the thing they cannot get past. It is a great blunt cylinder, fat and round and utterly without grace, housing a radial engine the size of a garden shed. One of the pilots stares at it and says, more or less to himself, that it looks like a container for spoiled milk, a 7-ton milk bottle. The man who said it was James Goodson, and the phrase would follow the aircraft for the rest of the war. To understand why that morning landed on these men like a bereavement, you have to understand who they were and what they were being asked to give up. These were not conscripts handed a machine and told to make do. These were the pilots of the 4th Fighter Group, and most of them had come to the fight the hard way, long before their own country had entered it. Volunteers who had crossed an ocean to sit in British cockpits, while the United States was still officially neutral. They had flown in the Eagle squadrons, those units of American pilots folded into the Royal Air Force, and they had earned their Spitfires in combat over the Channel and the coast of occupied France. The Spitfire was not simply the aircraft they had been issued. It was the aircraft they had learned the war in. It was the machine that had carried them through their first fights and brought them home when better men did not come home. A pilot's bond with the airplane that has kept him alive is not sentiment. It is closer to superstition and closer still to love. And now they were being told to hand it back, to roll those Spitfires away to some other squadron, and to climb instead into the biggest, ugliest, heaviest single-engine fighter anyone had ever built, the Republic P-47 Thunderbolt. It weighed, fully loaded, as much as 17,500 pounds, the heaviest single-engine fighter of the entire war, before or since. It was built around the Pratt & Whitney R2800 Double Wasp, a monstrous 18-cylinder radial that made the delicate inline Merlin of the Spitfire look almost dainty by comparison. It carried 8 50-caliber machine guns, 4 in each wing, an armament so heavy that a single squeeze of the trigger could saw a fighter in half. It was armoured in a way the Spitfire was not. Wrapped in steel plate, its pilot cocooned in a machine that had been designed from a hard lesson. That airplanes which could not take punishment did not bring their pilots home. None of that mattered to the men on the hard stand that morning. What mattered was that it was slow to climb, sluggish on the controls at low speed, and it did not could not, feel like the thing they had worn into battle. It felt, they said, like a moving van. It felt like a bathtub with wings. It felt like being asked to trade a thoroughbred for a farm cart and go race it against the best pilots in the Luftwaffe. There is a story, often told, that captures the mood exactly. Later, after they had begun to fly the thing, after they had learned what it could and could not do, Goodson and Don Blakesley were talking over one of the aircraft's few obvious virtues. The Thunderbolt could dive. God, could it dive. All that weight became an asset when you pushed the nose down. The machine would gather speed like a boulder rolling off a cliff, and it would leave almost anything behind it going downhill. Goodson made some remark about that, about how well the great brute dove, and Blakesley, who had no patience for consolation prizes and who had complaints about the aircraft longer than his arm, cut him off with the driest possible verdict. "It damn well ought to be able to dive," he said. "It sure as hell can't climb." That was the feeling in those first weeks. A machine that fell out of the sky beautifully and clawed its way back up like a wounded ox. A machine nobody had asked for and nobody wanted. Their own commanding officer disliked it. The men flying it disliked it. And the central question, the question that hangs over everything that comes after, over every fight and every funeral and every mile of sky between England and Berlin, is a simple and almost human one. Can an aircraft that begins its life unloved ever be loved? The men who would answer that question were not interchangeable. They were three very different men, and it is worth knowing them before the shooting starts, because each of them would end up in a different kind of relationship with the same machine, and because the war being what it was not guaranteed that any of them would live long enough to change his mind about it. Start with the man who coined the insult. James Goodson was born in New York, but he grew up in Toronto, which made him something in between. An American by birth, a Canadian by upbringing, and a man who had gone to war before either country he could claim officially had one to go to. His path into the fight had begun not in a cockpit but on the deck of a passenger liner. In September of 1939, in the very first days of the war, a German U-boat torpedoed the SS Athenia in the North Atlantic. Goodson was aboard. He survived the sinking, a young man in the water, or in a lifeboat, watching a ship full of civilians go under in the dark of the war's first hours. And whatever a night like that does to a man, it did not turn Goodson away from the fight. It seems to have turned him toward it. He joined the Royal Air Force. He flew Spitfires in the Eagle squadrons, and when those squadrons were folded into the United States Army Air Forces, he came with them into the 4th Fighter Group, and he stayed. By the war's end, he would be one of the group's leading aces, credited with 15 enemy aircraft destroyed in the air and 15 more destroyed on the ground, a total that put him among the most successful pilots the group ever produced. But in the spring of 1943, he was simply one more furious young man on a cold hard stand, looking at the milk bottle and mourning his Spitfire. He had a gift for the perfect cutting phrase, and he used it. The name he gave the Thunderbolt stuck to it like tar. Then there was Don Blakesley. If Goodson had the tongue, Blakesley had the will. He was hard-driving, taciturn, allergic to sentiment, a natural commander in the specific way that combat produces. Men would follow him not because he was warm, but because he was almost impossibly good, and because he flew more and harder and closer to the edge than any of them. Blakesley did not so much lead the 4th Fighter Group as haul it into the fight behind him. He would come to be one of the defining figures of the American air war over Europe, a man who logged an astonishing number of hours in combat, who was said to have flown more missions than almost anyone, and who seemed to regard rest as a personal insult. And Blakesley, of all of them, was among the most vocal critics of the new aircraft. The line about diving and climbing was his. He looked at the Thunderbolt's sluggish, heavy-footed climb and made his contempt plain. It says something about the machine and about the man that Blakesley would go on to become one of the pilots who wrung the very most out of the thing he first dismissed. But that was later. In the spring of 1943, he was simply the group's most impatient skeptic, and his skepticism carried weight precisely because he was so good. And then, in another group entirely at another airfield, there was a young man who would soon give the Thunderbolt the single most extraordinary demonstration of its worth in the entire war, though he did not know it yet, and would not have wished the demonstration on anyone. Robert S. Johnson was a farm boy, an Oklahoman out of Lawton, one of those young Americans for whom flight had been a fever caught early and never shaken. He flew with the 56th Fighter Group, not with the ex-Eagle Squadron veterans of the 4th, but with a unit built almost from scratch on the Thunderbolt itself, a group that would come to be identified with the aircraft more completely than any other. Johnson had a farm boy's steadiness, and something more than that, a fighter pilot's aggression that would eventually make him one of the deadliest men in the sky. He would become the first pilot of the United States Army Air Forces in the European theatre to pass the mark set by Eddie Rickenbacker in the last war. Rickenbacker's 26 victories, the American benchmark of aerial combat, a number that had stood for a generation. Johnson would finish with 27, but the number is not the thing that would make his name. What would make his name was a single morning in late June of 1943, when everything that could go wrong for a fighter pilot went wrong at once, and the ugly, unloved, over-armoured dinosaur under him refused, flatly, stubbornly, against every reasonable expectation, to let him die. We will come to that morning. For now, hold these three in mind: Goodson with his phrase, Blakesley with his contempt, Johnson with the fate he did not yet know was coming. 3 men, 1 machine, and a question none of them could answer in that first raw spring. Because to understand the machine, you have to go back further than any of them. You have to go back 3 years and across an ocean to a drawing board on Long Island and the mind of the man bent over it. Farmingdale, New York, 1940, the Republic Aviation Corporation. The man at the drawing board is named Alexander Kartveli, though that was not the name he was born with. He was born Alexandra Kartvelishvili in Georgia, in the Caucasus, in 1896, into a world that no longer exists, an empire that would soon be swept away by revolution and war. When the Bolsheviks took control of Georgia, Kartveli fled. He went to Paris, as so many of the displaced and the brilliant did in those years, and there he studied engineering, the new science of flight in particular, that intoxicating young discipline that in his lifetime had gone from canvas kites to metal monoplanes. And then, in 1927, he crossed the Atlantic and made himself an American. He was not alone in that émigré story. In 1931 he joined the Seversky Aircraft Corporation, working under another Georgian exile, Alexander de Seversky, the aviator and inventor and evangelist of air power, whose name the company then carried. There is something almost novelistic in it. 2 men out of the vanished Caucasus, building the fighter aircraft of a country that had taken them in, on an island off the coast of New York. When Seversky's company reorganized and became Republic Aviation, Kartveli stayed on as its chief designer, and it was to him that the crucial task fell. Kartveli was, by every account, a man of proportion. That is the word that comes up again and again about him. Proportion, balance, the aesthetic sense of an engineer who believed that a good aircraft, like a good building or a good sentence, had a rightness to it that you could feel before you could measure it. He thought in curves and loads and the elegant distribution of stress. He was meticulous. He was proud. And in 1940, when the Army Air Corps asked Republic for a new fighter, the aircraft he first envisioned was very much a creature of that sensibility, a lightweight interceptor, small, nimble, fast to climb, quick on its feet, the very qualities the pilots of the 4th Fighter Group would soon be mourning in their lost Spitfires. It was the fighter the fashion of the moment called for, the fighter every designer in the world was drawing in one form or another, light, clean, economical, elegant. The designs had names: the XP-47, the XP-44 called the Rocket. On paper they were handsome things, the natural expression of everything Kartveli believed about how an aircraft ought to be. A light airframe, a modest engine, speed bought by shedding weight rather than adding power. It was the design philosophy of a man who thought in proportion, and it was, in the summer of 1940, already obsolete, though Kartveli did not yet fully know it. Because while Kartveli was drawing his elegant little interceptor on Long Island, the actual war was happening on the other side of the Atlantic, and the actual war was sending back reports. And the reports were not kind to elegant little interceptors. Over France, over the Low Countries, over the burning summer sky of the Battle of Britain, a truth was being written in wreckage and casualty lists that no drawing board could ignore. Lightly built, lightly armoured fighters were being torn apart. A fighter that had traded protection for performance was a fighter that could not absorb the punishment of modern combat. The concentrated fire of cannon and heavy machine guns, the slashing high-speed pass, the sudden ambush from above and behind. The margins were brutal. A pilot who caught even a short burst in the wrong place did not limp home to fly again. He went down, and the aircraft that had been so light and so fast because it carried so little was revealed, in the merciless arithmetic of combat, as a machine that could not keep its pilot alive. What the fighting in Europe was telling the engineers was as blunt as it was expensive to admit. Firepower was not enough. Speed was not enough. Agility was not enough. An aircraft had to be able to take hits, real hits, punishing hits, and keep flying. It needed armor plate around the pilot and the vital systems. It needed self-sealing fuel tanks that would not turn the whole machine into a fireball the moment a bullet found them. It needed weight of firepower, not a rifle-caliber pea-shooter, but guns heavy enough to kill. In the fraction of a second, a pilot got a target in his sights. And all of that, the armor, the sealed tanks, the heavy guns, the ammunition to feed them, all of that weighed. It weighed enormously. And a heavy aircraft needed a heavy engine to move it, which weighed more still, which called for more fuel, which weighed more again, in the vicious upward spiral that every aircraft designer knew and dreaded. You cannot bolt that lesson onto an elegant lightweight interceptor. You can only start over. And so, in the middle of 1940, the Army Air Corps cancelled the contracts for Kartveli's lightweight designs. The XP-47, the XP-44 rocket. The elegant little interceptors were dead. Everything Kartveli had drawn, everything that expressed his instinct for proportion and economy and grace, was swept off the table in a single administrative stroke. For a proud man, for a meticulous man, for a designer who thought in balance and beauty, it must have cost something to let it go. There is no other way to read it. To scrap not just a design but a philosophy. To accept that the war did not care about the rightness you could feel before you could measure it. That is a hard thing. But Kartveli did not sulk, and he did not cling. He did what the best of them did in those years. He listened to what the war was telling him, and he started again from nothing. The story that has come down about what happened next is almost too neat, and yet it is the story that Republic and Kartveli themselves told, and it fits everything we know about the man. On a train back to New York, the ordinary rattling commute of an aircraft designer between meetings and the drawing board, Kartveli began to sketch. Not the interceptor he had loved, its opposite. He sketched a fighter built the other way around, built from the pilot outward, and from the lesson of the European fighting outward. Begin with the armour, begin with the 8 heavy guns, begin with the fuel it would need to fight far from home, and then find an engine powerful enough to haul all of that into the sky and make it fast. The engine he found, or that found him, was the Pratt & Whitney R2800 Double Wasp, that great 18-cylinder radial, one of the most powerful aircraft engines America could build. And a radial engine of that size dictates a shape. It is round and it is fat, a cylinder of raw mechanical muscle, and it demands a fuselage built to wrap around it. That is where the milk bottle came from. That is where the blunt round nose the pilots would sneer at came from, not from any failure of Kartveli's eye for proportion, but from the iron logic of the engine and the mission, and the war's hard lesson about survival. Kartveli knew exactly what he had drawn. He was not fooling himself about its grace. When he looked at the thing taking shape under his pencil, the sheer size of it, the weight, the barrel chest and the great blunt snout, he described it with a wit as dry as anything Blakesley ever said. It would be a dinosaur, he admitted, but it would be a dinosaur with good proportions. That single sentence is the key to the whole aircraft, and to the man. He had not abandoned his sense of proportion. He had simply been forced to apply it to a beast rather than to a bird. If the war demanded a monster, then he would build the best proportioned monster ever drawn. A machine that was huge, yes, and heavy, yes, and ugly by the standards of the fashionable little fighters of the day, but balanced, coherent, right in its own enormous way. A dinosaur, but a dinosaur that made sense. The prototype, designated the XP-47B, keeping the number of the dead interceptor even as it discarded everything else about it, first left the ground on the 6th of May, 1941. What flew that day was unlike anything American aviation had put in the sky. A fighter that weighed nearly twice what the elegant interceptor would have, wrapped around its enormous radial, bristling with the 8 guns and clad in the armour that the fighting over Europe had insisted upon. From that first flight would eventually come more than 15,000 of them, one of the great production runs of the war, an aircraft that would fly on every front and carry a generation of young men through the worst of it. But all of that was still to come. On that spring morning at Debden 2 years later, none of it was visible. The men on the hard stand did not see the 15,000 aircraft or the great production lines or the frontline miles from England to Germany. They did not see Kartveli on his train, sketching the opposite of everything he loved. They did not see the wreckage over France that had forced the design. They saw only the thing itself, the 7-ton milk bottle, squatting fat and round-nosed where their beloved Spitfires used to sit, and they felt the specific grief of men being asked to give up the machine they trusted for one they were sure would kill them. They could not have known, standing there in the cold with the gulls wheeling over the perimeter track, that the very qualities they despised that morning, the weight, the armour, the brutish over-engineered toughness of Kartveli's dinosaur, were about to be tested in a way no drawing board could have predicted. That within a matter of weeks, over the coast of occupied Europe, one young Oklahoman would discover exactly what all that hated weight was for, and would come home to tell them. To understand what that Oklahoman would discover, to understand why a machine so heavy, so hated, so contrary to everything a fighter pilot's instincts told him he wanted, required the men at Debden to reach back past their own grief to the reports that had made the aircraft what it was. Because the Thunderbolt did not begin as a monster. It began, like so many designs of the late 1930s, as an idea about lightness. And the story of how it grew, how it swelled from a nimble little interceptor into the heaviest single-engine fighter the world had ever put into mass production, is the story of a lesson learned in blood over the fields of England and France, a lesson written into the aircraft's very bones long before the first American ever cursed at it. The lesson arrived on paper. It came in the form of combat reports, translated intelligence, gun camera footage, and the quiet, damning accounts of what happened to airframes and to the men inside them when cannon shells found their mark. Through the last months of 1940 and into 1941, those reports crossed the Atlantic and made their way to Farmingdale on Long Island, where Republic Aviation had its plant and where Alexander Kartveli sat over his drawings. What the reports described was not abstract. It was specific, and it was merciless. Over southern England, during the great daylight battles of the previous summer, fighters had met each other at closing speeds that left only seconds to fire, and the weapon that increasingly decided those seconds was the cannon. The German fighters carried them, 20mm guns firing explosive shells rather than the solid rifle-caliber rounds that had defined the previous generation of air combat. And an explosive shell does to an aircraft what a rifle bullet cannot. It does not merely punch a clean hole and pass through. It detonates, it tears, it opens a wing spar or a fuel line or a cockpit floor with a violence that a lightly built machine simply cannot survive. This was the hard arithmetic that reached Kartveli's drawing board. The elegant little interceptors that the fashion of the age admired, the fast, thin, minimally armoured darts that could climb like startled birds and turn inside anything, were being torn to pieces. Not always, not every time, but often enough, and in a pattern that could not be ignored. A pilot in such a machine had almost nothing between his body and the enemy's shells. A single well-placed burst could open him up. The very lightness that made those fighters climb and turn so beautifully was the lightness that killed their pilots when the shells came. And the men writing the reports had begun to understand something that would take the rest of the world longer to accept. That in the industrial war now unfolding, a fighter's ability to survive being hit mattered as much as its ability to avoid being hit. Perhaps more, because a pilot was not a bullet, expended once and forgotten. A pilot was a scarce and precious thing, months in the training, and an aircraft that brought him home to fly again tomorrow was worth more to the war effort than a slightly faster machine that killed him the first time an enemy round found it. Kartveli read those reports as a man reads a verdict on his own work. He was not building interceptors in the abstract. He had drawn, and drawn with pride, the very kind of a lightweight fighter the reports were now condemning to death. The XP-44, the earlier lightweight studies, the whole graceful lineage of small, quick, minimally protected machines. All of it belonged to precisely the school that Europe's skies were dismantling. And here was the thing that separates an engineer from a merely talented draftsman. Kartveli did not defend his drawings. He did not argue with the evidence or trim it to fit the design he already loved. He looked at what the war was telling him, and he understood that the aircraft he had been building was obsolete before it had ever fired a shot in anger. So he did the hardest thing a designer can do. He threw it away and started again. But starting again meant confronting a chain of consequences that led, link by iron link, straight to the 7-ton milk bottle. Because if a fighter had to survive cannon fire, it had to carry armour, real armour, steel plate behind the pilot's seat and around the vital systems, weight that no lightweight design could bear. And if it had to carry armour, it had to carry an engine powerful enough to haul that armour into the sky and still fight. And if it had to fight the enemy's cannon-armed machines on their own terms, it needed guns of its own. Not a pair of rifle-caliber weapons, but a battery heavy enough to smash an armoured opponent in the same fleeting seconds that decided every duel. Armour demanded power. Power demanded a bigger engine. A bigger engine demanded a bigger airframe. A bigger airframe demanded still more power to move it. Each requirement fed the next, and the whole design spiraled upward in weight and size, and there was no point at which the spiral could be arrested without abandoning the survivability that had started it. This was not a failure of restraint. It was the logic of the war followed to its conclusion. At the centre of that spiral sat the engine, and here the choice was almost made for him. To move the mass the mission now demanded, Kartveli needed the most powerful engine American industry could put into production, and in 1940 that meant one machine above all others, the Pratt & Whitney R2800 Double Wasp. 18 cylinders arranged in 2 rings, air-cooled, a masterpiece of American mechanical engineering, capable of putting out power on a scale that the inline engines of the day could not match. It was, quite simply, the biggest hammer in the toolbox, and around a hammer that size you cannot build a delicate thing. The Double Wasp was enormous. It was round and it was broad, and it wanted a fuselage that could wrap around its bulk, and the moment Kartveli committed to it, the shape of the whole aircraft was decided. The blunt nose, the barrel chest, the sheer girth of the thing, all of it flowed from the engine, and the engine had been chosen because nothing smaller could do the job. The mission required survivability. Survivability required power. Power meant the double wasp, and the double wasp meant a monster. Yet the engine alone did not account for all the aircraft's peculiar mass, nor for the strange internal architecture that made it unlike any other fighter of its day. For the P-47 was not merely a big fighter. It was a high-altitude fighter, meant to fight and win in the thin air miles above the Earth, where the enemy's bombers and their escorts would have to be met, and thin air starves an engine. A radial that roared with power at sea level would gasp and weaken as it climbed, unless it could be fed compressed air to make up for the thinness. The answer was a turbo supercharger, a device driven by the engine's own exhaust that rammed air back into the cylinders and gave the double wasp its full might at altitudes where other engines faltered. But the turbo supercharger was not a small accessory bolted on somewhere convenient. In the P-47, the unit was mounted far back in the fuselage, behind and below the pilot, near the tail. And that decision imposed a burden on the entire design that few outside the engineering rooms ever fully appreciated. Consider what it meant. The engine sat at the front, breathing in the nose. The turbo supercharger sat at the back, near the tail. Between them ran the plumbing that connected the two, great ducts carrying exhaust gases rearward to spin the turbine, and carrying compressed air forward again to feed the engine, running the entire length of the fuselage. This was not a fighter with an engine and a fuel tank and a pilot and little else. This was a fighter built around a system, an intricate loop of intake and exhaust and compression that threaded from nose to tail and back again, occupying volume that in any other machine would have been empty air. It was one of the reasons the fuselage had to be so deep, so full, so massive in its cross-section. There was a great deal packed inside that barrel chest, and it was one of the reasons the Thunderbolt's fuselage swallowed roughly 4 times the internal volume of the Spitfire it was now replacing on the hard stands of Debden. 4 times the sheer enclosed space, wrapped in aluminum, bristling with the machinery of high-altitude war. When a pilot who had spent 2 years in the tight, close, glove-fitting cockpit of a Spitfire climbed for the first time into the cavernous belly of a P-47, the difference was not a matter of degree. It was a difference of kind. He had gone from wearing an aircraft to sitting inside a building. Then there were the guns. The combat reports had been clear on that point too. In the second or two a fighter had to fire before the geometry of the dogfight tore the two machines apart again. A pilot needed to deliver enough weight of metal to be decisive. A light armament that merely peppered an armoured opponent was worse than useless. It announced your presence and warned your enemy while doing him no fatal harm. So Kartveli gave the Thunderbolt a battery that would become one of the most feared armaments of the war. 8 50 caliber Browning machine guns, 4 in each wing staggered along the leading edge. 8 heavy guns, each hammering out rounds the size of a man's finger, all firing at once. When a P-47 pilot pressed the trigger, the aircraft seemed to hesitate in the air from the recoil, and where those 8 streams converged, they did not pepper. They soared. They cut. They could shear through the structure of an enemy fighter or rake the length of a locomotive or a truck or a rail car with a density of fire that few aircraft of the war could match. But 8 guns and their ammunition are heavy. The belts of 50 caliber rounds threaded through the wings weighed hundreds of pounds. Here again the arithmetic ran only one way. Firepower meant weight. Weight meant more power to carry it. More power meant the double wasp, and the whole edifice grew taller. And the armour. Always the armour. The thing that had started it all. The reports from Europe had been written in the language of pilots who died because there was nothing between them and the shells. Kartveli would not let that be the story of the men who flew his aircraft. Behind the pilot's seat he set steel plate, a solid slab of armour thick enough to stop what the fighting had shown must be stopped. Around the pilot, in the vital zones, protection was worked into the structure. It was, in the end, only about an inch of steel at the pilot's back, but that inch was chosen and placed with the full weight of the European lesson behind it. That inch was the difference between a man crouched behind it who lived and the same man in a lighter machine who did not. It cost weight, of course. Everything cost weight. But it was the one cost Kartveli was least willing to trim, because it was the whole reason the aircraft existed. The Thunderbolt had grown into a monster precisely so that it could be a monster that brought its pilot home. So when the design was at last complete on paper, the enormous engine, the full-length ducting for the turbo supercharger, the 8 guns and their heavy belts, the steel plate at the pilot's back, all of it wrapped in that deep, blunt 4 times a Spitfire fuselage, Kartveli understood exactly what he'd made. He understood that his engineering staff, men trained like him to admire lightness and grace, and the clean fast lines of the fighters they had all grown up drawing, would look at this thing and recoil. He knew what they would see: a bloated, overfed, impossibly heavy machine that violated every instinct they had about what a fighter ought to be. He knew the objections were coming, and he knew in the honest part of his mind that the objections were not entirely wrong. This was not the aircraft any of them had wanted to build. It was the aircraft the war had forced them to build. And so, when the moment came to present it, Kartveli did not wait to be criticised. He criticised it first, in his own words, with that dry émigré wit, and in doing so disarmed every objection before it could be spoken. It would be a dinosaur, he told them, but it would be a dinosaur with good proportions. That phrase deserves to be turned over slowly, because it holds within it the entire philosophy of the machine and the entire self-knowledge of the man who drew it. He did not say it would be graceful. He did not pretend it was beautiful by the standards of the little fighters they all loved. He conceded the whole point of the criticism at once. Yes, it is huge. Yes, it is heavy. Yes, it is a great lumbering creature out of another age. A dinosaur. But then came the second half, and the second half is where the pride lived. Good proportions. He was telling his staff that within the constraints the war had imposed, the engine that had to be that big, the armour that had to be that thick, the guns that had to be that many, the ducting that had to run the whole length of the airframe. Within all of that he had drawn the machine as well as it could possibly be drawn. Nothing was wasted. Nothing was clumsy for its own sake. Every pound of that enormous weight was there for a reason that a dead pilot over France had already paid for. It was a monster, but it was a coherent monster, a balanced monster, a monster that made engineering sense in every line. If they were going to be forced to build a beast, then by God it would be the best proportioned beast anyone had ever put into the sky. And that is the aircraft the men of the 4th Fighter Group inherited on the cold hard stands of Debden, though they did not know a word of this history, and would not have cared to hear it if they had. They had not read the combat reports that condemned the lightweight fighter. They had not felt the arithmetic that spiralled upward from that first requirement to survive. They had not sat with Kartveli as he threw away his own beloved drawings and started again around an engine he had not chosen for its beauty. All of that reasoning, all of that hard-won wisdom was invisible to them. It had been folded into the aircraft, buried in its bones, expressed only in the mute language of steel plate and gun barrels and the great deep barrel of a fuselage. What the pilots saw was the surface, and the surface was everything their instincts told them to distrust. Where a fighter should be light, this was heavy. Where a fighter should climb, this, everyone was already sure, would wallow. Where a fighter should be a tight, responsive extension of the pilot's own body, this was a cavernous machine you sat inside like a passenger in a truck. Every quality that Kartveli had built in as a virtue read, to the men who had to fly it, as a vice. They gave it the names that men give to things they resent. The 7-ton milk bottle for that blunt round nose and the fat body behind it. The jug, which would follow it to the end of the war and beyond. An affectionate name in time, but a wary one at the start. The Flying Bathtub for the sense of sitting down inside a great enamelled tub with the world far away over the rim. And the jokes came, as jokes come to men who are frightened and will not say so plainly. Blakesley, hard-driving and blunt as ever, weighed the whole thing in a single sardonic line. It ought to be able to dive, he said, taking one look at the sheer mass of it, because anything that heavy would surely fall like a stone if you pointed it down. It certainly can't climb. That was the verdict of the fighter pilot's instinct, delivered before the aircraft had been given a fair chance to answer for itself. A thing this heavy could not possibly haul itself up into the sky with the urgency a fighter needed. It would dive, yes. Gravity would see to that. But climbing was work, and a 7-ton machine, they were all certain, was too much work for any engine to lift. They were half right, and the half they were right about would haunt the early months. The Thunderbolt was no climber, not at first, not in the way a Spitfire was a climber. In the low and middle altitudes where much of the early sparring happened, a lightly loaded German fighter could pull up and away from a P-47 and leave it labouring, and there was nothing the American pilot could do but curse the weight he was carrying. For a fighter pilot whose entire trade is the trading of altitude and energy, this was a genuine and dangerous deficiency, and it was not imagined. It was real, and men would nearly die for it before the tactics were worked out that turned the aircraft's strengths against the enemy, instead of asking it to fight on terms it could not win. In those first weeks, the milk bottle jokes did not feel like jokes. They felt like a fair assessment of a machine that had taken away the beloved Spitfire and given back in exchange a lumbering giant that could not keep up in a climb. But there was another half to Blakesley's line, and it was the half nobody at Debden was thinking about on that cold morning. It ought to be able to dive. He had meant it as an insult. A heavy thing falls fast, so what? Yet buried in that throwaway sneer was the first hint of the truth that would eventually turn every one of these skeptics around. Because the same weight that made the Thunderbolt a poor climber made it a diving machine unlike anything the Germans could match. Point that 7-ton mass downhill, open the throttle, and it did not merely descend. It accelerated with a savagery that left pursuers standing, plunging toward the earth at speeds that pressed toward the very limits of what an aircraft of that era could survive. A German fighter that thought it had escaped by climbing away might find, moments later, that it could not escape a Thunderbolt coming down. And the toughness, the armour and the overbuilt structure and the sheer mechanical redundancy that made the aircraft so heavy meant that a P-47 could take a diving run to its limit, absorb the tremendous forces, and pull out at the bottom with its pilot alive and its structure intact. The weight was not only a burden, the weight was a weapon. It just did not look like one from the hard stand. None of this could be argued into the men. It could not be proved on a chalkboard or promised in a briefing. The Thunderbolt's virtues were not the kind that reveal themselves at rest, parked fat and ugly on the concrete. They were virtues that only combat could disclose, the specific, brutal, unrepeatable circumstances of being hit and hit again and refusing to fall. Kartveli had built survivability into the machine, but survivability is a quality that can only be demonstrated one way, and it is a terrible way. It requires a pilot to be caught, cornered, punished, and shot to pieces, and then to come home anyway, so that the ground crews and the doubters can walk around the wreck and count the holes, and understand, at last, what all that hated weight had been for. That demonstration was coming. It was only weeks away now, out over the coast of occupied Europe, where the sky was full of German fighters looking for exactly the kind of lumbering, poor-climbing target the P-47 was reputed to be. And the man who would provide the demonstration, who would give the milk bottle its answer to every joke ever made about it, was already flying with the 56th, learning the machine, unaware that he was about to become the living proof of everything Alexander Kartveli had drawn on a train 2 years and an ocean away. To understand what that demonstration would mean, one has to go back before the combat, before the milk bottle jokes, before the 4th Fighter Group ever laid unhappy eyes on the thing. One has to go back to a spring morning on Long Island in 1941, when the aircraft was not yet a legend or a laughingstock, when it was simply an experiment sitting at the end of a runway at Farmingdale, and nobody on Earth yet knew what it could or could not do. The man who would find out first was a Republic test pilot named Lowry Brabham. On the 6th of May, 1941, he climbed into the cockpit of the prototype, the XP-47B, the very first of the breed, and prepared to take Kartveli's dinosaur into the air for the first time. It was an act of some considerable nerve. The airplane was the largest single-engine fighter anyone had ever attempted to fly. It carried a supercharging system of a complexity that had never been packaged into a fighter before. a system of ducts running the length of the fuselage, feeding a turbine buried behind the pilot, a machine within a machine. There was no manual that could tell Brabham how the thing would behave, because nothing like it had ever behaved at all. He advanced the throttle, felt the R2800 pull, and lifted the great weight off the runway at Farmingdale into the New York sky. What he found on that first flight, and on the flights that followed, was a contradiction that would define the aircraft for the next 2 years. The Thunderbolt was fast. It was breathtakingly, almost unreasonably fast. Faster in level flight than very nearly anything else in the air at the time, a speed that seemed to make a mockery of its bulk. Here was a machine that looked like it belonged in a hangar full of transport aircraft, and yet when Brabham pushed the throttle forward it surged ahead of expectation, the airspeed indicator climbing past figures that its size had no business producing. That was the promise. That was the part of the aircraft that made the engineers at Republic believe, against all the evidence of its appearance, that they had built something extraordinary. But the same flights revealed the shadow side. The climb, which Blakesley would later immortalize with his single contemptuous line, was there in the test data from the beginning. Down low in the thick air near the ground, the airplane fought the sky. It did not leap. It did not spring upward the way a Spitfire or a Messerschmitt did, converting engine power into altitude with an eager willingness. It hauled itself up, deliberate, labouring, every foot of altitude earned against the drag of 7 tons of steel and aluminum, and the dead weight of all that armour Kartveli had insisted upon. A test pilot could feel it in the seat of his pants, the difference between an airplane that wanted to climb and an airplane that agreed to climb only under protest. The numbers confirmed what the body already knew. At the altitudes where the coming war would actually be fought, the Thunderbolt would arrive late. And then there was the third thing, the strangest and the most dangerous of the three, the thing that had no name yet, and that nobody fully understood. When Brabham took the aircraft into a high-speed dive, the very manoeuvre that would one day become the Thunderbolt's signature, its salvation, the tactic that turned it from a liability into a terror, something happened to the controls that no engineer had predicted and no pilot had prepared for. As the airspeed built toward the limits of what the era's aircraft could achieve, the controls began to stiffen. The stick, which had answered readily in ordinary flight, grew heavy, then leaden, then almost immovable, as though the air itself had thickened into something solid pressing back against every input. Worse, at certain speeds the ailerons could begin to shudder and buck, a violent flutter that threatened to tear the wings apart, a vibration born of forces that the aerodynamicists of 1941 and 1942 were only beginning to grasp. They had a word for it eventually. They called it compressibility. It was the phenomenon that would come to haunt every fast aircraft of the era. The approach to a barrier that no propeller-driven machine had yet crossed, where the airflow over the wings and control surfaces began to behave in ways that the smooth, predictable equations of ordinary flight simply did not describe. As a fast aircraft dived, the air moving over its wings could accelerate to speeds approaching the speed of sound long before the aircraft itself reached that speed, and when it did, the air stopped flowing the way wings were designed to make it flow. Shockwaves formed. Lift collapsed in places and spiked in others. Control surfaces lost their authority, or worse, developed a will of their own. Pilots who pushed too hard into a steep, fast dive could find the controls frozen solid in their hands. The airplane locked into a plunge it would not come out of, the ground filling the windscreen while the stick refused to move. Brabham documented it. He flew the dives, felt the controls go rigid, felt the buffeting build in the airframe, and brought back the reports that told Republic's engineers they had a problem they did not yet know how to solve. It was one of the cruel ironies of the Thunderbolt's early life. The dive was the aircraft's one great gift, the manoeuvre at which it excelled beyond any competitor, the thing its very weight made it supreme at. and the dive was also the maneuver that could kill a pilot in a way that had nothing to do with the enemy, that could kill him by carrying him faster and steeper than the physics of 1942 knew how to accommodate. The gift and the curse were the same act. It would take years of work, redesigned control surfaces, and eventually devices to counteract the effect before the Thunderbolt's pilots could push their dives to the full and trust the machine to bring them out. In the early days, they simply had to learn where the edge was, and to respect it, and to hope they never crossed it by accident with the German on their tail. So this was the aircraft that came off the production lines at Farmingdale and began crossing the Atlantic to England in the first months of 1943. Fast, but slow to climb. Powerful, but heavy. Capable of a dive that no enemy could follow, but capable also of a dive that could freeze in a pilot's hands and take him into the ground. A machine of contradictions, arriving into the hands of men who wanted none of them, who had loved something else and lost it, and who now stood on the hard stands at Debden looking at these enormous, ugly newcomers with an emotion that ran deeper than skepticism. It was closer to grief. The reaction was immediate, and it was contempt. There is no gentler word for it. The pilots of the 4th Fighter Group had come up through the Eagle Squadrons flying Spitfires, and the Spitfire had ruined them for anything less responsive. They had known the fingertip touch, the sense of an aircraft that answered a thought before the hand had finished making it. Goodson would put it plainly years later, describing what it was to make the change. It was daunting, he said, to haul 7 tons of plane around the sky after the fingertip touch needed for the Spitfire. That was the whole of it in a sentence. The Spitfire was flown with fingertips. The Thunderbolt was hauled. The one was a partner, the other was a load. And so the jokes hardened. What had begun as gallows humour, the milk bottle, the bathtub, the 7-ton jug, began to feel less like humour and more like a verdict. Blakesley's line was the sharpest of them, and it was sharp precisely because it was true, because it was not a fanciful insult, but a cold report of the aircraft's most glaring failing. It ought to be able to dive. It certainly could not climb. Every pilot who took the machine up in those first weeks confirmed it for himself. They would firewall the throttle and haul back on the stick and feel the airplane grudge its way upward while the imagination supplied, unbidden, the memory of what a Spitfire would have done with the same command. The comparison was unfair and constant and impossible to stop making. The reputation of the aircraft, already low when it arrived, sank lower with each passing week of familiarity. Familiarity in this case bred exactly the contempt the proverb promised. The commanding officer hated it. The aces hated it. The line pilots hated it. And the enemy, out over the coast of occupied Europe, was about to discover that the Americans had traded their nimble Spitfires for something big and slow climbing, and to draw precisely the conclusions one would expect. But contempt in a training area is a survivable condition. Contempt confirmed in combat is not, and it was in combat in the spring of 1943 that the Thunderbolt's climbing deficiency stopped being a matter of wounded pride and became a matter of arithmetic. The coldest and most unforgiving arithmetic there is, the arithmetic of bombers that went out and did not come back. The problem was one of geometry and fuel, and it worked like this. The 8th Air Force had committed itself in 1943 to a doctrine of daylight precision bombing, the belief that heavy bombers, flying in tight defensive formations in broad daylight, could reach deep into Germany and destroy the enemy's capacity to make war. The bombers were the B-17 Flying Fortress and the B-24 Liberator, and they went out by the hundreds, and the theory held that their massed defensive guns would be enough to fight off the German fighters that rose to meet them. The theory was wrong, and it was wrong in a way that cost thousands of lives before it was corrected. The bombers could not defend themselves. They needed fighters to escort them, to ride shotgun through the gauntlet of German interceptors, to keep the wolves off the flock all the way to the target and all the way home. And the fighter that was supposed to do that job in the spring of 1943 was the Thunderbolt. Here is where the climb rate stopped being an insult and became a body count. When a formation of P-47s took off to escort the bombers, they did not launch, and instantly find themselves at altitude alongside the fortresses. They had to climb, and the Thunderbolt, as every pilot at Debden could have told the planners, climbed like a freight elevator. The great weight that Kartveli had built into the machine, all that armour and structure and mechanical redundancy, exacted its price on the way up, and the price was time and fuel. By the time the escorts hauled themselves up to the altitude where the bombers flew, they had already burned through a punishing share of their fuel simply getting there. And fuel, for a fighter, is range, and range is time on station, and time on station is the whole reason the fighter is there at all. So the P-47s would rendezvous with the bombers, take up their protective stations, escort the great formations partway toward the target, and then, at a certain point over the continent, the fuel gauges would fall to the level at which the pilots had no choice. They had to turn back. They had to leave the bombers and fly home, because to press on any farther was to run the tanks dry over enemy territory and fall out of the sky. And so, again and again in that terrible spring, the escorts would peel away and turn for England while the bombers droned on alone toward Germany, toward the very deepest, most dangerous stretch of the mission, the part of the route where the Luftwaffe's fighters massed in the greatest numbers and struck with the greatest fury. The Germans learned the pattern quickly. They were not fools. They watched the escorts turn back at a predictable distance, and they simply waited beyond it. They let the Thunderbolts fly home, and then fell upon the undefended bombers with everything they had. Cannon-armed fighters diving through the formations, rocket-firing aircraft standing off and hurling explosive projectiles into the massed ranks of the fortresses, single-engine and twin-engine fighters wheeling in to pick off the cripples and the stragglers. The bombers fought back with their defensive guns, and they died. They died in numbers that would eventually shake the entire strategy to its foundations. Formations that crossed into Germany with dozens of aircraft came home with gaps where whole squadrons had been, and the escorts, the fighters, whose entire purpose was to prevent exactly this, were not there. They were circling uselessly on the wrong side of the line, or already back over England, out of fuel and out of the fight, forced to abandon the men they had been sent to protect at the precise moment those men needed them most. That was the tactical crisis of the Thunderbolt in the spring of 1943, and it must be understood not as an embarrassment but as a catastrophe. The milk bottle jokes had been about pride, about the humiliation of trading a thoroughbred for a plough horse. But this was not about pride. This was about the crews of the B-17S and B-24s, 10 men to an aircraft, flying deeper and deeper into Germany with their protection stripped away at the halfway mark, watching the little friendly shapes of the escorts wheel off toward home and knowing what came next. The Thunderbolt's limitations were not a matter of wounded fighter pilot vanity. They were written, week after week, in the loss reports, in the empty bunks, in the letters that went home to families in America. The aircraft's climb rate and the fuel it burned in the climbing had a cost, and the cost was paid in the lives of men who never flew a Thunderbolt at all. The question that hung over the entire enterprise, over every hard stand and every operations room and every drafting table back at Farmingdale, was whether the thing could be fixed, whether the escort problem was a temporary growing pain or a permanent condemnation, whether the Thunderbolt, for all its speed and all its toughness, had simply been built for the wrong war, a war it could not reach, over targets it could not stay above, guarding bombers it could not protect all the way. There were men in the spring of 1943 who looked at the arithmetic and concluded that the daylight bombing campaign might not be survivable at all, that the losses were unsustainable, that no fighter yet existed that could hold the enemy off across the full depth of Germany. The Thunderbolt in that dark accounting was not the answer. It was the confirmation of the problem, and yet, the answer, when it began to come, did not arrive as a single revelation. It was not a moment of triumph, a day when everything changed. It came the way most real answers come in war, slowly, in fragments, in a scattering of engagement reports filed by individual pilots over the spring and early summer of 1943, each one a small piece of a picture that no one had yet assembled. And what those reports began to show, once someone thought to read them together, was that the Thunderbolt could do certain things that nothing else in the sky could do, and that if it were flown as what it was, rather than as a heavy and disappointing substitute for what it was not, it became a formidable and even a fearsome weapon. The first of those things was the dive. Everything the skeptics had said about the Thunderbolt's weight was true on the way up, and every word of it reversed on the way down. Point that 7-ton mass at the Earth, open the throttle, and it accelerated with a violence that no German fighter could match. A Messerschmitt or a Focke-Wulf that thought it had a Thunderbolt beaten, that broke off and dived away expecting to leave the heavy American behind, would find to its horror that the American was not falling behind at all. He was gaining. The very weight that made the P-47 sluggish in the climb made it unstoppable in the plunge, and a German pilot who dived to escape could find himself overhauled and killed by the aircraft he had been mocking a minute before. The escape route the enemy trusted most became, against the Thunderbolt, a death sentence, provided, of course, that the American pilot respected the dark edge of that gift, the compressibility that lurked at the bottom of the fastest dives, and did not follow his prey past the point where his own controls would freeze in his hands. The second thing was the toughness, and it was here that Kartvelli's hated weight finally began to speak in its own defence. Report after report came back describing Thunderbolts that had absorbed damage that would have destroyed any lighter aircraft. Engines that ran with cylinders shot away, structures that flew with great holes torn through them, pilots who came home behind that single inch of armour plate that had stopped what would otherwise have killed them. The air-cooled radial engine with no vulnerable radiator and no delicate cooling lines to be severed by a single lucky round, kept running when a liquid-cooled engine would have seized and died. The overbuilt structure, the sheer surplus of metal that made the aircraft so heavy, meant that a Thunderbolt could be hit and hit again and keep flying. The machine was hard to kill. It was perhaps the hardest single-engine fighter in the world to kill, and that quality, which had shown up on the drawing board only as unwelcome weight, revealed itself in combat as something close to salvation. And the third thing was the guns. 8.50 caliber Browning machine guns, 4 in each wing, all of them firing together. It was a weight of fire that no other single-engine fighter of the war could match. When a Thunderbolt pilot got an enemy aircraft into his sights and pressed the trigger, he sent out a torrent of heavy rounds so dense that a single well-aimed burst could tear a German fighter apart in an instant, could saw through a wing or gut a fuselage, or turn an engine into scrap in the space of a heartbeat. The Thunderbolt did not need to linger on its target the way a more lightly armed fighter did. It struck once, hard, with overwhelming force, and moved on. That concentration of firepower suited the aircraft's emerging style perfectly, because the style that its pilots were beginning to develop was not a style of patience and turning and lingering. It was a style of the single decisive pass. Slowly, out of these reports, a way of fighting the Thunderbolt began to take shape, a way that had nothing to do with how a Spitfire was flown, and everything to do with what the P-47 actually was. The pilots called it dive and zoom, and it was built entirely around the aircraft's strengths and around avoiding its one great weakness. Instead of trying to climb into a fight and turn with a lighter, nimbler enemy, a contest the Thunderbolt could only lose, the P-47 pilot would use his altitude and his supercharged engine to establish himself high above the battle, where the Thunderbolt's high-altitude performance was in fact superb. From that perch he would wait and watch, and when the moment came he would roll over and dive, using that unmatched acceleration to fall on the enemy with tremendous speed. One pass, 8 guns firing together, and then, instead of trying to turn back into the fight and mix it up at low speed where he was vulnerable, he would carry his speed on through and zoom back up to altitude, converting the energy of the dive back into height, resetting himself for another pass, never allowing the enemy to bring him into the slow, turning duel where the Thunderbolt's weight would betray him. It was a discipline as much as a tactic. It required a pilot to master his own instincts, to resist the pull of the dogfight, to refuse the turning contest even when a target seemed to beckon, and to trust instead in the diving pass and the climbing escape. Flown that way, the Thunderbolt was no longer a failed Spitfire. It was a different kind of weapon entirely, a hammer rather than a rapier, a machine that did not fence but struck. And flown that way, it began quietly, in the engagement reports of that spring and early summer, to win. The transformation was not yet complete. The escort range problem remained unsolved. The bombers were still dying beyond the point where the fighters turned back, and the milk bottle jokes had not yet died on the lips of the men at Debden. The Thunderbolt was still, in the eyes of most who flew it, a thing to be endured rather than admired. But the pieces of its vindication were assembling, one report at a time, out over the Channel and the coast of occupied Europe. The dive that no enemy could follow, the toughness that no enemy could overcome, the guns that no enemy could withstand. All that remained was for one man, in one impossible morning, to gather all three of those qualities into a single act so extreme, so far beyond anything the doubters had imagined the aircraft capable of surviving, that no joke could stand against it afterward. He was flying with the 56th now, over that same dangerous coast, and the morning that would make him the answer to every insult the milk bottle had ever endured was very nearly upon him. The morning of June 26, 1943 opens without ceremony over the coast of northern France. It is a clear day, the kind of high summer clarity that fighter pilots both love and fear. Love, because it lets you see the enemy coming. Fear, for exactly the same reason. Somewhere below and behind the returning bombers, the sky's empty in the way that means nothing at all, because the emptiness of a June sky over occupied Europe is never truly empty. It is a room with the lights off and someone breathing in the corner. Lieutenant Robert S. Johnson is 22 years old, an Oklahoman a long way from Oklahoma, flying with the 61st Fighter Squadron of the 56th Fighter Group. His aircraft is a P-47C Thunderbolt, serial number 41-6235, and on its cowling is painted a name that would become, within hours, a small joke against the enormity of what it endured. Half pint. 7 tons of airframe, 18 cylinders of Pratt & Whitney radial, 8 50 caliber guns and an inch of steel plate behind the pilot's spine. And someone, with the particular humour of men who fly heavy machines, had christened it Half Pint. On this morning the name will be tested against 16 Focke-Wulf 190s and found, in the end, to mean something entirely different than the man who painted it intended. The mission that has brought Johnson here is escort. The bombers had gone out against the airfield at Villers-Coublay near Paris, one of the daylight strikes of the 8th Air Force against the machinery of the Luftwaffe itself, an attack on the very places where German fighters were born and armed and sent up to kill American bomber crews. The B-17S have done their work and turned for home, and the fighters have come out to meet them and shepherd them back across that stretch of the return route the Thunderbolts could still reach. This is the whole of the escort problem laid bare in a single sortie. The fighters cannot go all the way to the target and all the way back, so they meet the bombers on the return leg, at the edge of their range, in the exact place and at the exact moment when the bombers are tired and scattered, and the German fighters, fresh and coordinated, come up to feed on the stragglers. It is the most dangerous stretch of air in the theatre, and Johnson is flying through it near a place called Forgy-les-Eaux, in the Normandy country, where the fields below are green and the hedgerows draw their ancient boundaries, and none of it means anything to a man watching the sun for the glint of a wing. They come out of that sun, 16 of them, Focke-Wulf 190s, the best that Germany had put in the air by the summer of 1943. A squat, powerful, air-cooled radial fighter that could turn and climb and roll with a viciousness that made it, in a close fight, everything the Thunderbolt was not. 16 against a formation caught wrong, caught with the sun in its eyes, caught in the moment of relaxation that comes when the target is behind you and home is ahead. The Germans call this being bounced, and the Americans call it the same, and the word is exactly right, because there is nothing measured about it. It is a fall from above at closing speeds that leave no time for anything except the reflexes a man has drilled into his hands, and the reflexes of a pilot with as few missions as Johnson had were not yet the reflexes that save a life. The 20mm cannon shell is the thing the whole Thunderbolt design had been built to survive. Everything Kartveli had done, the armour, the weight, the refusal of the lightweight interceptor, all of it had come from the combat reports of exactly this weapon, the explosive shell that tore lightly built fighters into confetti. Now, over Forges-les-Eaux, the theory and the shell met in a single aircraft with a single man inside it, and the accounting was brutal and immediate. Cannon fire walked across Half-Pint in the space of a heartbeat. The canopy shattered, the plexiglass that had been the pilot's only window on the world blown into fragments, some of it driven into Johnson himself, the rest torn away into the slipstream. The hydraulic system was destroyed, and here is where the story turns from bad to nearly hopeless, because the hydraulic lines ran fluid under pressure, and that fluid was flammable, and now it was loose in the cockpit and there was fire. Fire in an aircraft is the thing every pilot fears above all others, more than the enemy, more than the water, more than the fall. Fire is not a wound you can survive by being tough. Fire does not care about armour plate. Fire in a cockpit means seconds. A handful of seconds before the flames reach the fuel, before the heat reaches the flesh, before the smoke takes the eyes and the lungs and the last of a man's ability to do anything at all about his situation. Johnson's cockpit was burning. The flames were in front of him and around him, and the wind was pouring in through the shattered canopy and feeding them, and the only answer to fire in a single-seat fighter is to get out, to jettison the canopy, roll the aircraft over, drop free of the seat, and trust the parachute. He reached for the canopy, and the canopy would not move. The same cannon fire that had shattered it had jammed it. It hung open perhaps 6 inches, enough to let the wind in, enough to feed the fire, and not nearly enough to let a man out. 6 inches, the width of a hand. Between Johnson and the sky, between the burning cockpit and the clean cold air of escape, there was a gap of 6 inches that would not widen no matter how he fought it. He rolled the aircraft inverted, hanging in his straps above the earth, the way a man does when he means to fall clear of the cockpit, and there was nowhere to fall. The canopy held him in. He was inverted, on fire, over occupied France, in an aircraft that would not let him leave it. There is a particular quality to that kind of trap. It is not the ordinary danger of combat, where death comes as a possibility among other possibilities, where skill and luck and the aircraft's strength all have some part to play. This was a closing box. The fire would spread. The fuel would go. The mathematics of it admitted no escape, and Johnson, hanging inverted in the flames with the canopy jammed above him, had run out of things to try. He had done the one thing a burning pilot is trained to do, and the aircraft had refused him, and then the aircraft, having refused to let him out, saved him instead. Hanging inverted, out of control, the Thunderbolt fell into a spin, that violent corkscrewing plunge that is itself one of the ways a fighter kills its pilot. But the spin did something the man could not do for himself. It changed the airflow, tumbled the aircraft through the sky in a way that starved the flames, and somewhere in that plunging chaos the fire went out. Not because Johnson had fought it out, not because any system aboard had suppressed it. The fire went out because 7 tons of falling metal had thrashed through the air violently enough to smother it, and the aircraft that had trapped him had, in the same motion, spared him the fate the trap promised. He recovered from the spin. That in itself is worth pausing on. A half-blinded man in a burning then smoking cockpit, wind screaming through a shattered canopy, hydraulics gone, recovering a heavy fighter from a spin over hostile ground. He got the nose up, he got the wings level, he was alive and the fire was out, and for one moment there was the possibility of hope. But the cockpit was awash in hydraulic fluid, and that fluid was in his eyes. Half blind, he could see the world only in smears, and every instrument that depended on the hydraulic system was dead or lying to him. He was low now, far lower than he had been, the altitude spent in the spin. Behind him, above him, the fight had rolled on and away, the way fights do. The 16 Fokker-Wulfs and the scattered Thunderbolts and the bombers all carried off on their own vectors, leaving him behind in the sudden loneliness that follows a bounce. He was alone. He was crippled. He turned his shattered aircraft toward the one direction that meant survival, toward the Channel and England beyond it, and began the longest flight of his life. Think of what he was flying. Not a fighter any longer in any real sense. A wreck that still held its shape. An airframe full of holes with the wind roaring through the broken glass. Controls sluggish and uncertain with the hydraulics gone. The pilot wiping fluid from his eyes to steal glimpses of a horizon he could barely find. Every instinct that had been trained into him told him to nurse it, to hold it steady, to coax the wounded machine mile by mile toward the coast, and not ask it for anything it could not give. And so he flew it gently, the way you lead a badly injured animal, and the Channel came up ahead of him grey and enormous, and for the length of that crossing there would be nothing beneath him but cold water, and no help within reach if the engine finally quit. He was over that water, alone, when the second act of the morning began. Because Robert Johnson's ordeal on June 26th was not one calamity but two, and the first had only been the ambush. The second came now, when he had already survived what should not have been survivable, when the fire was out and the spin recovered, and the coast of England somewhere ahead in the haze, and a single Fokker-Wulf 190 slid into the empty sky behind him and found the crippled Thunderbolt limping home. There is no crueler moment in the whole account than this one. A man who has already been shot to pieces, who has already faced the fire and the jammed canopy and the inverted trap and the spin, who has already used up whatever ration of luck a pilot is owed in a single sortie. And now, with nothing left, with an aircraft that cannot manoeuvre and a pilot who can barely see, a fresh enemy arrives with full guns and unhurried intent. Johnson could not fight. That is the whole of it. He could not turn to meet the attack, because his aircraft would not turn the way a fighter must. He could not dive away, because he had no altitude left to spend. He could not climb, because the Thunderbolt could barely hold what height it had. And he could not bail out, because the canopy was still jammed at 6 inches, still holding him in exactly as it had over France. He was a target in the purest sense, an aircraft that could still fly straight and level and do nothing else, with a man inside it who could only sit and wait for what came. The German pilot came in for his first pass. He would have seen at once what he had found. An aircraft already ruined, streaming and holed and flying flat and slow and straight, offering no threat and no evasion. The easiest kill a fighter pilot is ever handed. He set himself behind it and opened fire, and Robert Johnson did the only thing left to a man who cannot fight and cannot run and cannot leave. He crouched. He hunched himself down behind the one thing between his body and the guns, the slab of armour plate that Kartveli had built into the seat back, the inch of steel that had been the whole argument of the Thunderbolt's design, the reason the aircraft was heavy, the reason it could not climb, the reason the men at Debden had called it a milk bottle and a bathtub and worse. That inch of steel. Johnson pressed himself down behind it, and made himself as small as a man can make himself, and he waited, and the rounds came. The German emptied his machine guns into the Thunderbolt. Not one burst, but a sustained hammering. the sound of it inside the cockpit beyond any imagining. The strike of round after round into metal, the whole airframe ringing and shuddering with it, pieces flying away into the slipstream, and when that first pass was done and the German had overshot, he did not break off and leave. He came around and did it again, 3 times. The lone Focke-Wulf made 3 separate firing passes at point-blank range against an aircraft that offered him no resistance whatsoever, and each time he poured his guns into it, and each time the Thunderbolt flew on. Hundreds of rounds, a volume of fire that would have destroyed any lighter aircraft several times over, that should by every reasonable expectation have found the engine or the fuel or the man or some vital line and ended it. And each time, when the firing stopped and the German pulled away to set up again, the Thunderbolt was still there, still flying, still bearing its half-blind pilot toward England across the grey water. Behind the armour plate, Johnson could do nothing but experience it. He could feel the impacts, he could hear them. He had no way to know, pass by pass, whether the next round would find the gap in the steel, would come through at an angle the plate could not stop, would reach the fuel and turn the whole aircraft into the fireball he had already once escaped. Each pass was a lifetime. Each pass ended and he was impossibly still alive, and then he heard the German coming around again, and it began once more. There is a kind of courage that consists of action, and there is another kind, harder and rarer and less celebrated, that consists only of enduring, of holding still and staying sane while something tries and tries and tries to kill you, and you can do nothing to stop it. That was the courage Robert Johnson needed over the Channel on the morning of June 26th, and he found it, crouched behind an inch of steel, waiting out an enemy's ammunition. And that is what finally saved him. Not a manoeuvre, not a shot returned, not rescue arriving out of the haze, but simple arithmetic. The German ran out of bullets. Pass after pass, the Focke-Wulf had spent its guns against an aircraft that would not fall, and at last there was nothing left to fire. The Thunderbolt had done the one thing it was built above all else to do. It had refused to die. It had absorbed a volume of fire that no fighter of the war was expected to absorb, and it had carried its pilot through it. And the enemy who had tried everything he had was left with empty guns and a target still flying. What the German pilot did then is the part of the story that men would repeat for the rest of their lives, and it is the part that lifts the whole account out of the mechanics of survival into something else entirely. He did not simply break off and fly home. He pulled his Focke-Wulf up alongside the shattered Thunderbolt, close, wingtip to wingtip, near enough to see across the gap between the two aircraft, and he looked over at the American he had spent all his ammunition trying to kill. What passed between them in that moment no camera recorded and no report can fully hold. 2 men who had each just tried, or endured, everything, suspended together over the cold Channel, one in a machine that would not die, and one who had proven he could not kill it. And the German rocked his wings, the pilot's gesture older than the war, a signal that means acknowledgement and salute, and something like respect. And then he peeled away and flew back toward France, and left Robert Johnson alone in the sky to finish the flight home. It is worth sitting inside the strangeness of that gesture, because it belongs to a world that the war would very nearly extinguish before it was over. This was not chivalry in the sentimental sense. Both men had been trying with total commitment to destroy each other only moments before, and the Germans' 3 passes had been made with the intent to kill, and no mercy in them at all. But when the killing proved impossible, when the enemy's aircraft had shown a toughness beyond anything the German had thought he could throw against it, and the enemy's pilot had shown the endurance to sit behind his steel and take it, the German answered that with the only language he had. He acknowledged it. He rocked his wings. He recognized, across the gap between 2 machines built to end each other, that he had met something that would not be ended, flown by a man who would not break, and he saluted both the machine and the man before he went home to reload and fight again another day. Who he was, no one can say with certainty. For decades, the pilot has been named in the retellings as Egon Meyer, one of the Luftwaffe's most formidable aces, a man who by that summer had made a specialty of the head-on attack against American bomber formations and who understood the 8th Air Force's fighters as well as any German alive. It is a name that fits the story. The great ace who could not kill the great survivor, the master gunner defeated by a slab of steel and a man's refusal to die. But the historians who have gone looking for the hard proof have not found it. There is no document that pins the encounter to Meyer with certainty, no record that closes the question, and so the name floats attached to the legend by tradition rather than evidence, and the honest account leaves it where it belongs. A lone Fokker-Wulf pilot, possibly Meyer, possibly another, who fired everything he had into Robert Johnson's Thunderbolt over the Channel, could not bring it down and rocked his wings before he left. The uncertainty does not diminish the moment. If anything, it enlarges it, because the gesture belonged not to a famous name but to the situation itself, to what one fighting man does when he meets, in the machine and the flesh of his enemy, something he cannot defeat and can only honour. And then he was gone, and Johnson was alone again, more alone now than before, because now he knew exactly how close he had come, and exactly how little stood between him and the end. The Channel was still beneath him, England was still ahead in the haze, his aircraft was still holed in hundreds of places, his hydraulics still gone, his eyes still stung with fluid, his canopy still jammed at that mocking 6 inches. Everything that had been wrong when the German found him was still wrong now that the German had left. The only thing that had changed was that the last of his enemies had thrown everything he possessed against the Thunderbolt and had failed, and the aircraft that the men at Debden called a milk bottle was still carrying its pilot home across the water, toward the coast of England and the runways beyond it, a machine full of holes, flying on the strength of the very qualities its critics had mocked, bearing a man who had learned in a single morning exactly what the 7-ton dinosaur was worth. The coast was coming up now. Somewhere ahead lay the ground and the landing and the reckoning of what one Thunderbolt could survive. The coast came up out of the haze the way land always does to a man who has stopped believing he will reach it, not all at once, but in stages, a smudge that hardens into a line that resolves into cliffs and fields and the pale scar of a runway laid across the green. Manston sat on the Kent shore, the nearest friendly ground to the continent, the airfield that generations of crippled aircraft had aimed for because it was the first thing a man could touch after the water. It had a long runway and a reputation for receiving the broken. Johnson pointed the Thunderbolt's fat nose at it and began the last and most dangerous part of the morning, because a landing in an aircraft with no hydraulics is not a landing so much as a controlled collision, and he had come too far to die in the final minute of it. He had no flaps to slow him. He had no reliable brakes. The undercarriage would have to come down by whatever emergency means the aircraft still offered, and even then he could not be certain both wheels would lock. His canopy was jammed at that same 6 inches it had jammed at hours of terror ago, so that if the aircraft flipped on landing he would be trapped inside a machine he could not open, upside down, with the fuel he had left pooling toward the hot engine. His eyes still stung. His instruments told him only part of the truth. And beneath all of it ran the simple arithmetic of an airframe that had been shot through in hundreds of places, whose structure no one had inspected, whose wings and control surfaces might have been holding together on nothing more than the momentum of not yet having failed. He brought it in anyway. He came down over the Kent grass and put the wheels on the ground and let the Thunderbolt roll out its own speed across the length of Manston's runway. And the aircraft that should have killed him a dozen times over that morning did not kill him now. It rolled to a stop. The engine that had taken hits and gone on turning finally went quiet, and Robert Johnson, 22 years old, half blind, burned in places, wounded by shrapnel he had barely felt, sat inside a machine that the ground crews of Manston were already walking toward with the particular expression of men who have seen a great many damaged aircraft and are about to see one that changes their scale. They began to count. This was routine. It was what ground crews did when a fighter came home marked. You counted the holes, you assessed the damage, you decided whether the airframe could be patched and returned to the war, or whether it had passed beyond repair into salvage. A dozen holes was a rough day. 24 was a story a pilot would tell in the mess for a week. The men at Manston began at the tail, or the wing, or wherever they started, and they moved along the fuselage counting, and the number climbed past anything the counting was built for. It passed 50. It passed 100. Somewhere above 200 before they had even worked their way around the whole aircraft. Before they had circled it once, they stopped. There was no point. The holes were not damaged to be tallied. They were the condition of the aircraft. The Thunderbolt was not a fighter that had been hit. It was a fighter that had been perforated from end to end, 21 of the wounds made by 20mm cannon shells, the rest by machine gun fire, and it had flown home across the English Channel with all of them, carrying its pilot the entire way. They wrote it off. There was nothing else to do with it. The airframe that had absorbed everything the Luftwaffe threw at it that morning had given the last of itself in the giving. It would never fly again. It was pulled aside for salvage, stripped of anything useful, and reduced eventually to the raw materials of the war it had already served. And this is the detail that carries the whole meaning of the morning, the one that Kartvelli's dinosaur was built around long before Robert Johnson ever climbed into a cockpit. The aircraft was destroyed, and the pilot walked away. The machine was expendable. The man was not. Every pound of weight the pilots at Debden had mocked, every inch of armour plate, every choice Kartvelli had made when he scrapped his lightweight interceptor and rebuilt the thing around survivability, had been made for exactly this, for the morning when an aircraft would be asked to die so that its pilot did not have to. The Thunderbolt had done precisely what it was designed to do. It had failed as a machine in order to succeed as a shield. Johnson's own wounds were minor. Shrapnel had caught him in places. The fire had burned him. The hydraulic fluid had blinded him for the worst minutes of the fight. But none of it was serious, and none of it kept him grounded for long. Within about 5 days, within a single week of sitting behind an inch of steel, while a German ace emptied his guns into him at point-blank range, Robert Johnson was flying again. Not convalescing, not recovering in some rear area hospital. Flying, over-occupied Europe, in a new P-47 that had rolled off the line at Farmingdale and crossed the Atlantic to replace the one now being cut up for scrap. He gave the new aircraft a name. He had it painted on the fuselage in the way pilots did, the way a man marks the machine that will carry his life. He called it Lucky. There is no way to read that name without hearing everything underneath it. The shattered canopy, the spin that put out the fire, the 3 passes he could not answer, the German who could not finish him, the 200 holes, the write-off, the weak. A man who had survived all of that and understood, better than anyone, how thin the margin had been, climbed into a fresh Thunderbolt and named it for the only word that fit. Lucky. He knew what had saved him. He knew the aircraft had absorbed an astounding amount of lead, as he would put it later in the plain language of a man describing something he had personally verified. And he knew too that the luck and the aircraft were the same thing, that what had felt like fortune was in fact 7 tons of deliberate engineering, and that the name on the new fuselage was as much a tribute to Kartvelli's design as it was to any providence watching over the Channel that morning. The story did not stay with Johnson. It could not. It was too perfect an illustration of the one thing his squadron mates most needed to believe, and it travelled through the 56th Fighter Group and then beyond it, with the speed of every legend that turns out to be true. The men who flew the Thunderbolt had spent months distrusting it, resenting it, comparing it unfavourably to the aircraft they had been forced to give up, and now here was one of their own, walked away from a machine that had taken over 200 hits, flying again within the week. It was not an argument, it was proof. You could not talk a fighter pilot out of his scepticism, but you could show him a friend who should have died and did not, and let him draw his own conclusion. The Thunderbolt's reputation had been in the balance all through that spring. The milk bottle, the bathtub, the dinosaur nobody wanted. June 26th did not settle it by itself. But it was the day the balance began to shift, the day the word durable stopped being something Republic's engineers claimed and became something the pilots had watched with their own eyes. The conversion of the men who had hated the aircraft did not happen in a single morning, and it would be false to pretend it did. Trust of that kind is not granted. It is earned, mission by mission, over the accumulating evidence of a machine that keeps doing what is asked of it and keeps bringing men home. Through the second half of 1943, in the two fighter groups that had received the Thunderbolt with the most open contempt, that evidence accumulated. The 4th at Debden and the 56th elsewhere in England flew the aircraft day after day into the airspace over occupied Europe, and day after day the aircraft revealed the qualities that its faults had obscured. It could not climb the way the Spitfire climbed. That was true and remained true. But it could dive faster than anything the Luftwaffe put into the air, and it could carry 8 guns to the target, and it could take punishment that would have finished any lighter fighter, and it could carry a pilot home across a great deal of water on the strength of an air-cooled engine that did not care about a bullet through a cylinder the way a liquid-cooled engine cared about a bullet through its coolant. Don Blakesley is the man to watch in this, because Blakesley had been the loudest. It was Blakesley who had delivered the line that followed the aircraft everywhere, that it ought to be able to dive because it certainly could not climb, and Blakesley said it with the authority of a pilot other pilots listened to, a hard-driving, blunt-spoken leader who did not soften his opinions for anyone. If the Thunderbolt was going to win over the 4th Fighter Group, it was going to have to win over Blakesley, and the way it won him was the only way that ever worked with a man like that. It let him kill Germans with it. Blakesley began to run up a score. The aircraft he had mocked for its inability to climb turned out to be a superb platform for the way Blakesley wanted to fight, high and fast, diving on the enemy from above, using the Thunderbolt's tremendous speed in the descent to close, fire and zoom back up out of reach before the enemy could answer. It was a style the aircraft's weight and diving power were built for, and it suited Blakesley's aggression exactly. The kills came, and a man does not go on insulting the machine that is making him one of the leading aces of the American war effort. He may not apologize for the earlier insults. Blakesley was not a man given to apology, but he stops repeating them, and he flies the aircraft harder, and his silence on the subject becomes its own kind of endorsement. James Goodson found the same thing by a different route. Goodson had coined the phrase that stuck harder than any other: the 7-ton milk bottle, the container for spoiled milk, the aircraft that felt to his hands like a lorry after the fingertip responsiveness of the Spitfire. Goodson was an aggressive pilot, a man who flew to close the distance and destroy, and the Spitfire had suited that aggression with its lightness and its instant obedience. What he discovered over the second half of 1943 was that the Thunderbolt suited a different expression of the same aggression. Where the Spitfire had let him dance, the Thunderbolt let him hit. The dive speed that Blakesley had grudgingly acknowledged put Goodson onto his targets, with a closing rate that gave the enemy almost no time to react, and when he arrived, the 8 guns delivered a weight of fire that the Spitfire's lighter armament could not match. A single 1-second burst from 8.50 caliber Brownings put out a torrent of metal, and a fighter caught in that torrent did not survive it. Goodson learned to trade the Spitfire's agility for the Thunderbolt's punch, and he found that the trade favoured a pilot who flew the way he flew. The kills accumulated for him as they did for Blakesley. Goodson would finish the war credited with 15 aircraft destroyed in the air and 15 more on the ground, a total that placed him among the group's most successful pilots, and the great majority of that work was done in the aircraft he had named for spoiled milk. The clearest measure of how far the men had come was not in what they said about the Thunderbolt, but in what they refused to give up. As 1943 wore on and the fighter groups matured, opportunities came to transition to other types. The P-51 Mustang was arriving in the theatre, a beautiful aircraft with the long legs the escort mission desperately needed, and it would in time re-equip much of the 8th Air Force's fighter strength, including the 4th Fighter Group itself. But among the pilots who had learned the Thunderbolt in blood over that summer and autumn, there were men, and the 56th Fighter Group was full of them, who did not want to let it go. They had come to it hating it, and had ended by trusting it more completely than they trusted any other machine, and the trust was of a specific and hard-won kind. The trust of a pilot who knows the aircraft will bring him home. The 56th would fly the Thunderbolt to the end of the war and become the highest-scoring American fighter group in the European theatre doing it, and it would do so in part because its pilots believed in the aircraft, with a conviction that no newer, sleeker fighter could shake. The men who had called it a milk bottle would, within a year of that first contempt, refuse to trade it for anything. That is the whole arc of the thing in a single fact. The aircraft nobody wanted became the aircraft they would not give up. And then, in the summer of 1944, the Thunderbolt revealed a second identity that its designer had not quite planned for, and that the escort mission had never fully demanded. It came down out of the high, cold air where it had spent its first year fighting, and it found its truest and most terrible work close to the ground. The context was Normandy. On the 6th of June, 1944, the Allies had put their armies ashore on the beaches of the French coast, and the war that followed was not the clean geometry of bomber streams and escort formations at 20,000 feet. It was a grinding, close-range, mile-by-mile struggle through the hedgerow country of Normandy, where German armour and infantry contested every field and every sunken lane, and where the men on the ground called constantly for help from the sky. The aircraft that answered was, more often than not, the Thunderbolt, and the qualities that made it answer well were precisely the qualities its critics had once held against it. Fitted with bombs beneath its wings, or with racks of rockets, or with both, the P-47 could carry a fighting load that turned it from an air superiority fighter into something the army had never possessed in such quantity. A fast, heavily armed, brutally durable machine that could deliver ordnance directly onto the enemy at the point of contact. It could carry up to 2,500 pounds of bombs or rockets, a load that would have seemed absurd for a single-engine fighter only a few years before, and it delivered that load with the same 8.50 caliber guns it had always carried, so that even after the bombs were gone it remained a strafing platform of tremendous power. Pilots who had trained for the dogfight, for the high-altitude turning duel against enemy fighters, found themselves flying a wholly different kind of mission, down at 50 feet above the Norman hedgerows, hunting tanks. The tactic that emerged carried a name that described it plainly: armoured column cover. As the American armoured divisions pushed inland, Thunderbolts flew above them, watching the roads ahead, and when they found a German column, tanks, half-tracks, trucks, guns, moving to reinforce or to counterattack, they came down on it. They used the same diving speed that had made them killers at altitude, but now they used it against targets on the ground, screaming down onto a road at low level, releasing bombs or firing rockets or raking the length of a column with all 8 guns, and then hauling the aircraft back up into a zoom climb that carried them out of range before the enemy's flak could find them. It was murderous work, both for the German columns caught in it and for the pilots who flew it, because coming down to 50 feet meant coming into the reach of every machine gun and every anti-aircraft weapon the enemy possessed, and the sky above a contested road in Normandy was a lethal place to be. This was where the Thunderbolt's weight, the 7 tons that had been its liability at every altitude the pilots had once cared about, became at last its greatest asset. At 0 altitude, against ground fire, the thing that saved a pilot was not agility or rate of climb, it was the ability to be hit and keep flying, and here the Thunderbolt had no equal. Its air-cooled Pratt & Whitney radial, the great 18-cylinder double Wasp that Kartveli had built the whole aircraft around, could take a hit that would have brought down a liquid-cooled engine and go on turning. A bullet through a cylinder cost it that cylinder and nothing more. The engine ran on the rest. The armour plate that had saved Robert Johnson from the German ace's guns over the Channel now saved 100 other pilots from the flak gunners of Normandy. The sheer size and strength of the airframe meant that a Thunderbolt could come home with damage that would have destroyed a lighter aircraft outright. The comparison the pilots themselves drew was with the P-51 Mustang, the elegant escort fighter arriving in growing numbers, a superb aircraft in the air, but one whose liquid-cooled engine made it dangerously vulnerable to ground fire because a single hit in the coolant system could seize the engine and end the mission. The Mustang was the better pursuit fighter, but down in the flak, at 50 feet over a German column, the pilots wanted the Thunderbolt, because the Thunderbolt could take the punishment that the low work demanded. Even the enemy said so. Heinrich Baer, one of the Luftwaffe's most experienced fighter pilots, a man who had fought the Thunderbolt across the length of the war, gave it the acknowledgement that came from hard experience, that the P-47 could absorb an astounding amount of lead and had to be handled very carefully. It was the same phrase, near enough, that Johnson used from the American side. The astounding amount of lead, arrived at independently by a man who had spent his war trying to shoot the thing down. When the aces on both sides of a fight agree, in almost identical words, that an aircraft cannot easily be killed, the point has been settled beyond any argument the skeptics at Debden could have raised. That durability translated directly into the one measure that mattered most to a war of attrition: the number of missions flown. Because the Thunderbolt could survive the punishment of ground attack, and because it could be patched and returned to service after damage that would have written off a more delicate machine, it flew and flew and flew. Sortie after sortie, day after day, across the whole front, it appeared over the battlefields of Normandy, and then over the pursuit across France, an aircraft that was seldom celebrated in the way the glamorous Mustang was celebrated, that carried no reputation for beauty, that had begun its career as the machine nobody wanted, and that ended by flying more sorties than almost any other American fighter of the war. The unglamorous workhorse did the heaviest labour. The dinosaur, exactly as its designer had promised, turned out to have good proportions after all. Proportions ideally suited to a job that beauty could not have done. For the pilots who flew it in this new role, the transformation of their own understanding was complete. They had been given the aircraft as air superiority fighters and had learned to trust it as such through the fights of 1943. Now, in 1944, they discovered that the same qualities they had learned to trust in the escort mission made it the finest fighter bomber in the American arsenal, and the trust deepened into something like affection. The 7-ton milk bottle had become the jug, and the name had lost every trace of its old contempt. It was said now with the rough tenderness a man reserves for the thing that has never let him down. Down in the hedgerows at 50 feet, in the flak that killed so many good pilots, the Thunderbolt kept bringing them back, its engine running on damaged cylinders, its wings holed, its fuselage marked, its pilot alive. And the war it was fighting was about to grow harder still, because the summer of pursuit across France would give way, in the cold of December, to a German counterstroke through the forests of the Ardennes that would test every aircraft in the Allied inventory, and would find the Thunderbolt once again refusing to go down. The snow came early to the Ardennes that December, and it came thick. In the forests along the German frontier, where the Belgian and Luxembourg borders folded into a country of steep wooded ridges and narrow valleys, the fog settled into the trees and did not lift. It lay in the hollows in the morning, and it lay there again at dusk. A grey ceiling pressed down over the pines, and beneath it the temperature dropped below freezing and stayed there. For an air force that had spent the autumn ranging across France almost at will, hunting anything that moved on the roads, the weather of mid-December 1944 was a wall. On the 16th, when the German army struck westward through the Ardennes with more than 200,000 men, and a concentration of armour no one on the Allied side had believed possible, the sky above the battlefield was closed. The bombers stayed on the ground, the fighter bombers stayed on the ground, and into that blind interval of days the German columns poured, exactly as their planners had intended, moving under a cover no gun could provide, the cover of a sky the enemy could not use. This was the calculation at the heart of the offensive. The German command had chosen its date by the forecast as carefully as by the terrain. They knew, as everyone in that theatre knew by the winter of 1944, what happened to armour on open roads when the Thunderbolts and the Mustangs and the Typhoons could see it. They had watched their own columns burn across the summer, watched the pursuit from Normandy to the German border become a slaughter conducted from 50 feet, and they had learned the lesson the only way an army learns it, by dying under it. So they waited for weather that would ground the aircraft, and they got it. For the first days of the Bulge, the men on the ground fought without the friend that had come to feel almost permanent overhead. In the crossroads towns and the choke points, in the fog among the trees, American soldiers held or gave way with no aircraft to call, listening to the grind of tank engines they could not see and could not answer. The overcast that protected the German advance was, from the ground, a kind of abandonment. Everyone waited for the same thing. Everyone waited for the sky to open. It opened on December 23rd. The weather cleared across much of the front, a hard, brilliant, freezing clarity, and when it did, the entire weight of Allied tactical air power came down out of that clear cold sky onto the roads and the woods and the columns that had been moving unseen for a week. What followed was not a battle in the sense the aces of 1943 would have recognised. There were no long duels turning in the high thin air, no single machines matched against single machines, no gentleman's salute of rocked wings. This was something the war had grown into: industrial-scale aerial warfare, mission stacked upon mission, the aircraft launching and striking and returning and launching again, day after day, in numbers and at a tempo that made the individual sortie almost anonymous. The Thunderbolt was built for exactly this. Not built for it in any way its designer could have foreseen when he sketched a high-altitude interceptor on a drawing board in Farmingdale, but suited to it in every quality he had chosen: the mass, the armour, the air-cooled engine that could lose a cylinder and keep turning, the airframe that could be holed and patched and flown again. In the cold over the Ardennes, the aircraft nobody had wanted became the aircraft the ground war could not have done without. Consider what those missions asked of the men who flew them. The cold alone was an enemy. At altitude, the Thunderbolt's cockpit was never warm, and in a Belgian winter the pilots flew half-frozen, their controls stiff, their instruments sluggish, the metal of the airframe cold enough to burn a bare hand. The work itself was the most dangerous kind of flying in the whole catalogue of aerial war. Ground attack meant coming down into the fire, down to the roads and the tree lines where every gun the German army possessed could reach up and touch you, where the flak was not the distant black bursts of the high escort missions, but a wall of tracer and shell thrown up from a few hundred feet, close enough to see the men working the guns. A fighter-bomber pilot did not have the sky to manoeuvre in. He had a target on the ground, and to hit it he had to fly a predictable path toward it, straight and low and slow enough to aim, into guns that knew exactly where he would be. This was the environment that killed so many good pilots across the war, and it was the environment the Thunderbolt had been unknowingly designed to survive. A hit that would have finished a lighter aircraft, a hit in the coolant line that would have seized a Mustang's engine and left it a glider over hostile ground. The Thunderbolt could shrug off and keep flying. Its air-cooled radial had no coolant to lose. Its armour sat where the fire came from, down in the flak of the Ardennes at the lowest and hardest work the air war offered. That difference was the difference between a pilot who came home and a pilot who did not. They came at the columns with everything they carried. The 850 caliber guns that Kartveli had built into the wings, 4 to a side, a weight of fire no other American fighter matched, swept the roads with a stream of metal that tore trucks apart and killed men in the open, and left the soft-skinned transport of a modern army burning nose to tail in the snow. The bombs came down on the choke points, on the bridges and crossroads where the German advance had to funnel through, on the tanks caught nose to tail on the narrow forest roads with nowhere to disperse. The Thunderbolt could carry a heavy load of ordnance and still fly and fight, and it brought that load down into the Ardennes valleys in an unrelenting rhythm. The purpose was blunt and it was total. One pilot who flew the ground attack work put it as plainly as it could be put. Their assignment was to prevent those columns from harming their own troops. That was the whole of it. Not glory, not victories painted on a fuselage, not the clean arithmetic of aerial kills. just the destruction of the enemy's ability to move and supply and fight, sortie after sortie, until the offensive that had been designed to run under a closed sky choked and died in the open under the sky's return. And the German command's calculation, which had been so exactly correct, unravelled precisely on schedule. They had bought a week of blindness from the weather, and the week had bought them ground. But an army on the offensive is an army that must be fed. Fuel, ammunition, food, the endless tonnage that a mechanized advance consumes and cannot advance without. All of it moved on roads. All of it moved through the same narrow valleys the terrain dictated. And when the sky cleared, all of it lay exposed to an air force that had spent the autumn perfecting the art of killing columns from 50 feet. The German spearheads, some of them already short of fuel, found their supply lines cut behind them by aircraft they could not fight and could not outrun. The tanks that had gambled everything on speed found the roads ahead of them cratered and the roads behind them burning. The whole momentum of the offensive, which depended on moving faster than the Allies could react, broke against an air power that reacted the instant the fog lifted and then did not stop. It was not one decisive blow. It was the accumulation of thousands of small ones. A truck here, a tank there, a bridge, a fuel dump, a column caught in the open and left in ruin. The industrial patience of an air force that could fly and fly and fly because its aircraft could take the punishment the work demanded and come back for more. This was the Thunderbolt's final identity, arrived at through a long correction of everyone's first opinion. It was not a thoroughbred. It had never been a thoroughbred, and by the winter of 1944 no one flying it wanted it to be. It was a workhorse, and the work it did in the Ardennes was the hardest kind. Cold, dangerous, unrelenting, unglamorous. The labour that wins wars without ever quite being celebrated for it. The men who had once called it a milk bottle now trusted it with their lives in the flak every single day, and it kept the faith. It brought them down into the fire and it brought them home out of it, its engine running rough on a shot cylinder, its wings holed, its fuselage scarred, its pilot cold and alive. In the freezing skies over Belgium, the aircraft did exactly what its designer had built it to do, though he had built it for a different sky entirely. Survivability had been Cartvelier's founding principle, the lesson he had taken from the combat reports of 1940 and 1941, the thing he had chosen over speed and grace when he tore up his lightweight designs and started again around armour and mass and firepower. In the Ardennes that principle paid its final dividend. The dinosaur held. By the end of January the offensive was spent, the bulge in the line pressed flat, the German army driven back to the frontier it had come from and worse off than when it started, having spent in that gamble the last reserves it would ever gather in the West. The Thunderbolts had not won the battle alone. No aircraft wins a land battle alone. But they had done the thing that made the German plan impossible the moment the weather allowed, and they had done it in conditions that would have grounded a more delicate machine or written it off in the flak. The workhorse had held the line, and as the war ground on into its final spring, the Thunderbolt kept doing the work it had made its own, over Germany itself now, over the collapsing remnants of the enemy's transport and supply, an aircraft that had long since stopped needing anyone to defend its reputation. When the accounting was finally done, the numbers told the truth that the pilots had come to understand one mission at a time. The Thunderbolt flew more combat sorties than almost any other American fighter of the war. It served in every theatre, over Europe from the high escort missions to the low ground attack, over the vast distances of the Pacific where its range and toughness suited the ocean war, over Burma and China and the Mediterranean. More than 15,000 of them were built, 15,636 by the final count, poured out of Republic's plants in a flood that matched the industrial scale of the war it was fighting. It was never the aircraft that captured the imagination the way the Spitfire captured it, or the Mustang. It carried no reputation for beauty, but it flew the most missions, absorbed the most punishment, and brought the most pilots home from the kind of flying that killed men. And in the end, those were the measures that a war of attrition actually kept. The machine nobody wanted to fly had done more of the war's flying than nearly anything else in the sky. The men who had doubted it lived to see it vindicated. Robert Johnson, the Oklahoman who had crouched behind an inch of armour over the channel while a German ace emptied his guns into a plane that would not die, finished the war with 27 aerial victories, having surpassed the score Eddie Rickenbacker had set a war before. He had learned to trust the aircraft the hardest way a man can learn anything, and the trust had held through every fight after. Don Blakesley, who had said the thing ought to be able to dive because it certainly couldn't climb, became an ace and a leader of aces, and made the dive tactic the doctrine of a whole fighter group. James Goodson, who had coined the milk bottle insult and survived the sinking of the Athenia in the war's first hours and flown through the whole long middle of it, finished with 15 victories in the air and 15 more on the ground. A full 30 aircraft destroyed by a pilot who had once looked at the Thunderbolt with contempt. They came home. All three of them came home. The doubter, the critic, the man who named it, carried through the war by an aircraft they had learned to love against their own first judgment, brought back again and again by a machine that refused to go down. Alexander Kartveli came home too, in the sense that his work went on. The Georgian émigré who had arrived at his design through a chain of hard decisions, armour, then power, then a bigger engine, then a bigger airframe to carry it all, did not stop when the war ended. He carried his philosophy of mass and power forward into the age that was coming, the age of jets, and he built for it the same way he had built for the last war. The F-84 Thunderjet came from his drawing board, and after it the F-105 Thunderchief, aircraft that inherited the name and the thinking of the Thunderbolt. Big, powerful, built to carry a heavy load into a dangerous sky and survive the doing of it. The lineage ran straight from the 7-ton milk bottle through the jet age, the same conviction expressed in new metal, that an aircraft's first duty is to bring its pilot home, and that everything else is negotiable. Kartveli's dinosaur had good proportions after all, and the proportions were the philosophy. He never abandoned it. He built it larger and faster, and gave it engines his younger self could not have imagined. But the bones of the thinking were the same bones he had laid down when he tore up a lightweight interceptor and started over around the question of survival. What remained, when the sorties were flown and the war was won, and the aces were home and the aircraft were being cut up for scrap by the thousand, was a question that had been there from the beginning, and that all the combat in between had answered without ever quite stating. It was the question of trust. What makes a pilot trust a machine? It is not beauty. The pilots at Debden had loved their Spitfires the way a man loves a good horse, loved the fingertip lightness of them, the responsiveness, the grace, and none of that love had anything to do with what won the war. It is not the first impression. The first impression of the Thunderbolt was near universal contempt, from the men who had to fly it, from the commanding officer who hated it, from the aces who mocked its climb and its bulk and its fat round nose. Trust is not given on sight. Trust is earned in the only currency that matters to a man who straps himself to a machine and flies it into fire, the currency of coming back. It is earned the way Johnson earned his trust in a shot-through Thunderbolt over the Channel, one bullet hole at a time over 200 of them, and a plane that flew anyway. It is earned in the flak of the Ardennes, mission after mission, a pilot going down into the guns at 50 feet and coming home cold and alive on an engine running rough on a damaged cylinder. Trust is what an aircraft accumulates by refusing again and again to let its pilot die. And by that measure, the only measure the men in the cockpits truly kept, the Thunderbolt was among the most trustworthy aircraft ever built, because it did the one thing better than almost anything else in the sky. It brought them home. Go back, then, to where it began, to the hard stand in the English spring of 1943, the aircraft sitting there enormous and unloved in the morning light, 4 times the fuselage volume of the Spitfires being handed back, the fat round nose that a pilot said looked like a container for spoiled milk. Go back to the men standing around it with their arms crossed, veterans of the Eagle squadrons, volunteers who had crossed an ocean while their own country was still neutral to fly for a cause they believed in, men who knew what a fighter should feel like and knew this was not it. They looked at 7 tons of metal and armour and radial engine and 8 guns, and they saw everything it was not. They did not yet see what it was. They could not have known, standing there in the cold morning by the strange heavy machine, that the thing they despised would carry them through the fights of 1943 and the beaches of Normandy, and the pursuit across France and the freezing hell of the Ardennes, and the last collapse of the enemy's sky, that it would fly more of their war than anything else they might have flown, that it would bring them home when lighter and lovelier aircraft would have left them dead in the flak, that they would come to say its name, the Jug, with the rough tenderness a man reserves for the thing that has never let him down. All of that was ahead of them, unearned and unimagined, on the hard stand in the spring light. They had been given the aircraft. They had not yet learned to trust it. That would come the only way it ever comes, the hard way, one mission at a time, one impossible survival at a time, until the milk bottle had become the jug, and the contempt had become something like love. A man learns to trust a machine the way he learns to trust anything, not by what it promises, but by what it does when everything is against it. The Thunderbolt was never beautiful. It was never meant to be. It was built to survive, and it survived, and in surviving it carried a generation of pilots through the worst war the world had yet made and set them down, alive, on the far side of it. The dinosaur with good proportions did exactly what its designer said it would do, not by being beautiful, by refusing again and again to go down,